Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. There's no shortage of ideas about the processing of people in this country illegally out of this country in terms of how to comply with federal court decisions and be in good standing when some of these matters ultimately make their way to the Supreme Court. You've heard at the state level, Ron DeSantis, we talked about last week, volunteer some of the JAG Corps officers in his National Guard to be administrative hearing judges to help the federal government process illegal immigrants residing in Florida out of the country, comply with some standard notion of due process and move the process along. Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz posted a video too discussing this and suggested that, look, you need probable cause to detain. And then one of the things that perhaps you could do to comport with it, again, sort of administrative, not a criminal, but an administrative standard of due process, is to remove them to a safe third country where they could access the American embassy and have a rolling series of administrative hearings where they can, if they weren't able to prove up their citizenship before they were removed, they could have a hearing where they could prove up their citizenship or their claim to access to our country through Zoom. So they're off American soil and they get their day in court, if you will. But even still, that calls into question the ability to do that with due speed when you're talking about the millions of people that we're talking about. So how should we think about a approach to due process that comports with the Supreme Court's decisions about the rights that anybody in this country is entitled to, and sort of the fairness argument that is being advanced in a lot of quarters, which is so a president can illegally I would argue, illegally open the borders and invite anybody from across the world to come in at their leisure and parole them into this country. He can do that en masse, but we can't remove same people en masse. That doesn't seem to make any sense. For some perspective on that issue and a few others, please be joined again by law professor Richard Epstein, the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yes, I'm ready for whatever questions you want to throw at me.
Well, let's do that. I'm sure you are, but let's do this. The due process. The Constitution is silent on illegal immigrants in large measures. It pertains to this, but we know through the development of the law there are certain rights that are conferred to individuals on American soil. So when you're talking about the numbers we're talking about and moving people from arrest for probable or detention for probable cause of being in this country illegally to a final order of removal, is there a way to do this en masse that would pass Supreme Court muster, constitutional muster with the High Court?
I think the answer to that question today is no. There has to be some degree of individualization. The question is just how exhaustive does it have to be? I think one of the things I would want to check is Obama, for all of his hesitancy on this issue, also deported millions of people, and he did so in accordance with the law. So one of the things that I would do is try to figure out what it is that he did and how much of it could be incorporated. I also agree with what Dershowitz says, is that you may not have to hold them in the United States during the hearing, but you have to hold them in an area where there's an access to that. But basically, if you start looking at the particular Constitution, there's another very interesting element there, which is no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It has no territorial component built into it. And we've had a number of cases in which people have been held by Americans overseas, and they said, well, the due process rights don't attach unless it turns out that they were shipped there from the United States, which would cover these cases. But even the other point, I think, is wrong. The question about whether or not you get due process is, are they in custody of the United States? Where they're held is, it seems to me, a complete mistake. Now, the question is then, can you get some kind of protocol that would do this? So, for example, tattoos would be a very powerful indication of one thing or another. Photographs of them crossing over the line without any objection from the Biden administration, or even having them help people get across into this country would be fine. Having sort of records of financial stuff about where they stayed and who hid them and so forth would be fine. The point about this is you certainly don't want to be giving 2-day hearings to everybody, but you're probably going to have to give them 30 minutes or whatever it is. I don't know how it would go, but I think it should be done. I mean, let me put it this way. The fact that Biden was illegal in the way in which he did things, and they were illegal, I mean, just let everybody in, doesn't mean that you can be illegal on the other side of this when you want to get them out. There's a long tradition in America, going back very, very far, which says that when you're trying to figure out what foreign policy is in terms of dealing with other nations and so forth, starting war and the judiciary has a very small role to play. But the moment it turns out that the rights of people, aliens included, that are at stake, then due process kicks in. I mean, I did these long debates over the 14th Amendment, because of the birthright citizenship case. But if you look at it, you'll see that citizens get one set of rights, but all persons get due process rights under the 14th Amendment. And so what happens is you can't shortcut this. You have to do it right. And for President Trump to shortcut it, he's got a legitimacy deficit that he has to cure.
Well, the Obama that you mentioned, the 3 million or so individuals that he deported, a majority of those, by some estimates, were done through expedited removal, where low-level immigration officers can remove certain non-citizens from the United States without a hearing before an immigration judge. And if you're an undocumented or an illegal that's put into an expedited removal proceeding, you're still entitled to access the asylum system, if they have a legitimate claim under asylum. But you could, it seems to me, you could do expedited removal in the same way that Obama did and have them access the asylum system on foreign soil.
Look, that's what I said. Essentially, the reason you want to do this is you need some cover. You don't want to be breaking all sorts of novel new grounds on legal theories when you have a massive problem, because if you do that, the whole thing is completely clouded down on your head. And one of the dangers that the Trump administration has done is it gives itself very broad authorizations under statutes which everybody reads much more narrowly than they do. The tariff stuff he's doing under an emergency act, which doesn't call for tariffs, doesn't even allow for them. All of the stuff with respect to the Alien Enemies Act would, in fact, allow him not only to deport members of gangs, but every person in a company, because the Alien Enemies Act says if they have their gang that's coming into this country, they're at war with us. So everybody from that country is an enemy alien, at least if they're 14 years old and male. And he's really on the edge of this stuff. So he has to be able to walk this thing back. And he wants to put a larger budget into it. I think that's fine. I did look at the budget. I think the budget for the war was probably not necessary now. The reason is, if you enforce the existing law, the immigration goes to a trip, and you don't have to do with that. Our major problem now is not keeping people out, and I think Trump deserves a great deal of praise for making good on that particular promise to stop the influx, which was massively disruptive. And now I think if he just completes it, he doesn't want to ruin his reputation by mishandling the deportation issue, in my judgment. I mean, he just really needs to have somebody do him. The problem that he has is he doesn't have any no men around him. Everybody's a yes man. And so he doesn't get any counter feedback, and that's the big difference between this administration and the last. And he's going to head over a cliff if he does this in the wrong way. Aliens are very funny people. Here was a joke that was told to me in all seriousness many years ago. Somebody said, I'm in favor of getting every illegal alien out of Texas except the ones who work for me.
Right. Yeah, right. Get it.
Yeah, so does everybody get it. The ambivalence is deep. If you show a personal attraction, it changes everything. The Trump strategy is trying to keep all these people anonymous. The other strategy will be try to individuate them. And I think somewhere between the two of them is probably the best way in which to go. I thought Biden made a terrible mistake back in 2021 when he said we're going to let people come into this country instead of putting them in detention facilities that we paid for and run in Mexico. But he was the world's worst president on just about everything he ever touched. And one of the things that has to happen is if you do something terrible in a former administration, the new administration, as a matter of law, is bound by it, even though it's hated it. And so what Trump has to do is to live with a dreadful Biden legacy. And I think the way to do it is to play it in accordance with something that's been done before. And the Obama stuff would give him an enormous amount of legitimacy. The real rhetoric that he does with respect to this and going forward has just hurt him terribly. And remember, his numbers are down, and they will continue to go down so long as people seem to believe that he has a streak of cruelty in the kinds of things that he does, and a streak of blindness with respect to the tariff issue, which I wrote about last week, and which, if we had time, we could happen to talk about.
So, yeah, let's talk about that, because you wrote that why reciprocal trade negotiations are going to fail. Can you explain?
Sure. What happens is, if you look at these things as an economic matter, every time you have an asymmetrical relationship, I buy from you and don't sell you anything, what happens is the trade deficit between those two parties starts to increase. Well, that sounds terrible. But remember, these people aren't being ripped up. Both parties have gained. And so the trade deficit gets large. At the same time, the opportunities for profit get larger as well. So what happens with the trade deficit? If you've got only two countries involved in this, then you have to start selling very inefficient things to people who don't want to buy them. So then look what happens to the deficit if you start adding two more people in. The guy who's selling everything to you is buying it from somebody else. He has a huge deficit there. And the guy that basically is paying it here sells it to somebody else and gets this huge credit there. So if you put it as a four-person game, all of a sudden the deficits shrink and the gains from trade start to increase. If you're doing reciprocal trade, you can't get advantage in figuring out how parties 2 and 3 work. Now, Trump is cagey, and if you listen to the way he's described it recently, he said, well, I'm going to negotiate with the EU instead of with Italy, Greece, Spain, and so forth. What happens is when you do a large negotiation like that, there's going to be much more reverse flow one way or another. The European nations have rightly pointed out that if you're looking at all this situation, you have to take into account services, which the Americans sell in abundance to Europeans. And then all of a sudden, in a $2 trillion economy, the net deficit is $50 billion or something, which is trivial to worry about. And so what happens is he has to concentrate on gains. And every time he relaxes a tariff, the stock market goes up. Every time he announces a new one, like today with the movies and so forth, the stock market starts to go down. But he's too bullheaded to simply say I'm wrong. That's just not part of his vocabulary. What he's going to do is he's going to start to grant more exemptions of one kind or another, delays, side deals. So already he's basically put some of the tariffs off of Canadian parts because the American supply lines go back and forth through Canada in a million different ways. And if you disrupt them at even one stage, both countries start to lose. Look, this is sequential production. That is, you do some A, B, C, D, and you're all on a railroad track, right? And you break the track at one place, you can't get from A to A. And that's what you do when you start putting these reciprocal tariffs on. And so it's really an extremely bad idea.
Well, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with you, as I've been articulating on this show since the Liberation Day, as he called it. But I mean, but my take on it from the beginning has been sort of rigid consistency.
The hobgoblin of little minds.
Yes, very good. Well, foolish consistency, I think, is the yes, but I don't think that's what he's going for either. I think my supposition from the beginning has been what he's going to do is there's going to be a lot of trade deals that look like the USMCA from his first term, where to varying degrees of complexity, and so the net will be more open markets for more American goods and probably more protections for some American industrial sectors. And the net is going to be perhaps modestly positive like the USMCA was.
Well, my guess is going to be largely negative because I think the ability to make these deals is much more difficult if they don't have matching constituencies. You can do it with Europe. You could do it with Israel. The Israelis were thrilled by making this kind of deal because they still have their very ancient labor history background, which causes all their production in many areas, and double open tariffs is a win-win on both sides. But it turns out you look at the Chinese negotiations and say, yeah, we're so happy to talk with you, but you have to drop all your tariffs first. And Trump doesn't want to do that. They don't want to deal. That's a huge economy. And where is it going to be really conspicuous if we don't get the flood of cheap Chinese toys into the United States for the selling system? It's a disaster. Remember,
yeah, but China, but not to interrupt. But I mean, China's has relaxed some of their tariffs too because they're not able to produce, for example, ethane on the mass scale that they need to, and so forth.
I mean, that's the exact point. But if you start putting these things on and have ad hoc exceptions, they do it the other way. Look, let me mention another point. If suppose your rival puts tariffs on you, how do you reciprocate? Well, a tariff is basically like predatory pricing because they accompany them with subsidies. And what you do is every time they want to subsidize something, you buy it and then use it in your production scheme. You want to make sure that you have long-term contracts to hedge against sudden disruption. On the other thing, when they put tariffs on themselves, what they do is they make themselves inferior competitors in the third world market. Mm-hmm. So one of the most amazing things about Europe is there's not a single major company that has formed in that place in the last 25 years. And the reason is between the tariffs, the antitrust restrictions, and so forth, and the crazy subsidies and the union domination, they can't do anything. So they hurt themselves for the benefit of us. They're killing themselves by putting tariffs on goods coming in because they then can't export. There's no reason for us to try to imitate them. My view on tariffs have generally been unilateral surrender gets you more in any market than does the stuff that they're having there. What I don't have is any confidence in Trump because of his rhetoric. Everybody who has a balance of trade that's positive with us is a cheater. You don't want to be talking like that. All it does is inflame people. And the other problem about it is you start getting into real ugly spikes about the tariff stuff, you lose political influence. You get liberal governments in Canada and Australia. He's dropped everything about Greenland, as far as I can tell, because it doesn't do it. So what he has to do is essentially has to be Trump 1, not Trump 2. Has to go back to what he did in the first administration with those kinds of people and start it over again. And he's just too bent on vengeance on every area of which I know for him to be effective. And the tariffs is one of the kinds of things that leaves me so completely unnerved. As you well know, every time somebody wanted to prosecute him before he was elected, I was 100% behind him in saying that these things were political witch hunts. I haven't changed my mind about that. But I don't want him to respond to stupid vengeance action by doing the same thing to his opponent. We really have to kind of clean up the act in the Trump administration. And if we do that, he can bring you the prosperity that he's promising. Remember, he's working off the worst administration in the history of Western civilization. Well, congratulations. In Biden, what you'd want to do is to make sure that the things that he did wrong, you undo, and he's undone a lot of them, right? One of the reasons why the economy is so strong, Dan, is the domestic change on energy production and so forth is a huge plus. At the same time, tariffs are a huge minus. Well, we could keep the plus without the minus.
Richard Epstein. James Parker Hall, Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thank you as always.
It's always a pleasure, and thank you, Amy.
Thank you, and have a wonderful day. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to podcasts of Dan and Amy from the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
Business owners, now's the time for your business to make the move to a locally owned business bank. Hi, Mike Gallagher here to let you know that you don't have to look far. Signature Bank was founded in Chicago with